Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Tonight's journey takes us to meet a man with a magnificent mustache who declared that God was dead, then spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what that actually meant for the rest of us. Picture this: a German philosopher walking alone through the Swiss Alps, scribbling furiously in notebooks while tears stream down his face. Not from sadness necessarily, but from the sheer intensity of ideas crashing through his mind like thunder. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and he didn't just question God, he questioned everything we thought we knew about morality, truth, and what it means to be human. Before we properly begin, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Nietzsche and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography. Now, when people hear Nietzsche's name, they often think of darkness, of nihilism, of a gloomy philosopher who hated everything. But that's not quite right. Strip away the misunderstandings and what you find is something far more interesting. A man who loved life so fiercely that he couldn't bear to see it wasted on lies. A thinker who believed that losing God didn't mean losing meaning, it meant finally having the courage to create our own. Of course, history got messy with his ideas. His sister twisted his words to support the Nazis. Existentialists claimed him as their own. Self-help gurus quote him out of context on Instagram. But tonight, we're not here for the noise. We're just here to meet the man behind the mustache. A brilliant, sensitive, deeply complicated thinker who wanted us to become who we truly are. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this deeply influential philosopher. This is the bedtime biography of Friedrich Nietzsche. The story begins in 1844 in a small Saxon village called Röcken, where the wind swept across flat Lutheran plains and church bells marked the rhythm of life. On October 15th, a boy was born to Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, a Lutheran pastor, and his wife Franziska. They named him Friedrich Wilhelm, after the Prussian king whose birthday he shared. The coincidence felt like destiny, as if the boy was meant for something significant. Young Friedrich's world was quiet, pious, and deeply traditional. His father preached sermons on Sundays while his mother kept house with the stern efficiency expected of a pastor's wife. The Nietzsche home smelled of ink and old theology books, of starched collars, and the particular silence that fills houses where God is always watching. But this peaceful childhood shattered when Friedrich was just 4 years old. His father began experiencing terrible headaches and seizures, his mind gradually dissolving in ways that terrified the family. Doctors couldn't explain it. Some whispered about brain softening, others about divine punishment. After months of suffering, Karl Ludwig died in 1849, leaving his widow and children adrift. The tragedy didn't stop there. Friedrich's younger brother Joseph died the following year, just 2 years old. For a sensitive boy barely out of infancy, these losses carved deep grooves into his soul. He would later write about the profound impact of watching his father's mind disintegrate, of learning early that even the most righteous life offers no protection from suffering. The family moved to Naumburg, where Friedrich grew up in a household of women. His mother, grandmother, and 2 aunts formed a tight circle of feminine influence, all deeply religious, all devoted to raising the boy properly. They called him the little pastor because of his serious demeanor and habit of delivering sermons to his playmates. Other children found him odd, too intense, more interested in books than games. At school, Friedrich excelled immediately. His teachers noted his exceptional memory, and his unusual ability to concentrate for hours on classical texts. By age 10, he was writing poetry and composing music at the piano, pouring his inner emotional life into creative expression. The other boys roughhoused in the schoolyard while Friedrich sat beneath trees, reading Greek mythology and German romantic poetry. When he turned 14, Friedrich received a scholarship to Schulpforta, one of Germany's most prestigious boarding schools. Founded in a former monastery, the school maintained an almost monastic discipline. Students woke at 5, attended classes until evening, studied ancient languages until their eyes burned. It was intellectual boot camp, and Friedrich thrived. At Schulpforta, he discovered the ancient Greeks, and they hit him like lightning. Here were people who lived before Christianity, before the concepts of sin and guilt, before anyone told them that suffering was redemptive. The Greeks embraced tragedy as beautiful, saw life as fundamentally tragic, yet worth celebrating anyway. This idea would haunt Friedrich for the rest of his life. His fellow students remembered him as withdrawn but not unfriendly, capable of sudden bursts of wit followed by long silences. He suffered from severe headaches, even then, migraines that would plague him throughout his life. When the pain came, he would lie in darkness, unable to read or think, just enduring. During these years, Friedrich began questioning his faith, though he hid it carefully. In a pious household, in a religious school, doubt was dangerous, but the questions gnawed at him. If God was good and all-powerful, why did his father suffer and die? Why did innocent children perish? The standard theological answers felt hollow, like pretty lies told to avoid uncomfortable truths. He graduated from Schulpforta in 1864 with a brilliant academic record and a growing sense that everything he'd been taught about God and morality might be fundamentally wrong. But he wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. At 20, Friedrich enrolled at the University of Bonn to study theology and philology, the study of ancient languages and texts. His mother hoped he'd become a pastor like his father, carrying on the family tradition of serving God. But Friedrich had other ideas brewing, ideas he wasn't quite ready to admit even to himself. University life in 1864, Bonn meant student drinking societies, dueling clubs, and rowdy fraternity houses. Friedrich joined a traditional student corps, tried to fit in with the beer-swilling crowd, even participated in some of the ritualized socializing. But it didn't take. He found the whole scene exhausting and pointless, all that energy wasted on getting drunk and singing nationalist songs. After just one semester, he made a decision that shocked his family. He announced he was leaving theology behind entirely, focusing solely on philology. His mother wept. His aunts worried for his soul. But Friedrich had crossed a threshold. He couldn't force himself to believe anymore, and unlike many who drift away from faith quietly, he needed to understand why. He transferred to the University of Leipzig in 1865, following his favorite professor, Friedrich Nietzsche, a brilliant philologist who recognized Friedrich's exceptional talent. Leipzig was less rowdy than Bonn, more serious, better suited to Friedrich's temperament. He threw himself into studying ancient Greek and Latin texts, spending 12-hour days in libraries, ruining his eyesight by candlelight. But the real earthquake in his intellectual life came from a chance discovery in a Leipzig bookshop. One October afternoon in 1865, browsing aimlessly, his hand fell on a book called The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. He bought it on impulse, took it home, and read through the night. Schopenhauer's philosophy hit Friedrich like a revelation. Here was a thinker who didn't sugarcoat reality, who said life is suffering, that existence is driven by blind, meaningless will, that happiness is mostly an illusion we tell ourselves to keep going. But unlike Buddhism, which influenced Schopenhauer heavily, the German philosopher didn't offer escape into nirvana. He suggested we face the horror head-on, find beauty in art and music, accept the tragic nature of existence. For Friedrich, already drifting away from Christian consolations, Schopenhauer provided a framework for understanding life without God. If there's no divine plan, no ultimate meaning, then we're free to create our own. If suffering isn't redemptive or meaningful, then we can stop pretending it is. This pessimistic philosophy paradoxically filled Friedrich with energy and purpose. He became a Schopenhauer evangelist, pressing the books on friends, discussing them obsessively. His letters from this period crackle with excitement, as if he'd discovered fire. Of course, he'd later move beyond Schopenhauer, criticizing his pessimism and resignation. But for now, the older philosopher was his intellectual father, replacing the biological father he'd lost. In Leipzig, Friedrich also discovered Richard Wagner's music. He attended a performance of Tristan und Isolde and left the theatre shaking. Wagner's operas seemed to embody everything Schopenhauer talked about: the raw power of music to express the inexpressible, to touch something primal beneath rational thought. Friedrich became obsessed. His academic work continued to shine. In 1867, at just 22, he published an article on ancient Greek sources that impressed the scholarly world. Ritschl wrote glowing recommendations, calling Friedrich the most talented student he'd encountered in decades. When a position opened at the University of Basel in Switzerland for a professor of classical philology, Ritschl recommended Friedrich so strongly that Basel offered him the job without even requiring a doctoral dissertation. This was unprecedented. Friedrich was 24, hadn't completed his doctorate, and was being offered a full professorship at a respected university. Leipzig quickly granted him a doctorate without examination based on his published work. Basel made him a professor, and the Prussian government released him from military service he'd barely started. Everything seemed to be falling into place. A brilliant young scholar on the fast track to academic respectability. But Friedrich was already cultivating ideas that would make him unemployable in polite academic society. He just didn't know it yet. Basel in 1869 was a proper, respectable Swiss city where professors wore dark suits and minded their manners. Friedrich arrived that spring to take up his position, becoming the youngest philology professor in Europe. He rented rooms, set up his books, prepared his lectures. On the surface, he looked like any other ambitious young academic, but something was already different about him. His colleagues noticed he didn't quite fit the mold. He was intense where they were measured, passionate where they were dry. His lectures on ancient Greek culture weren't just about grammar and translation. He talked about the Greeks as if they were alive, as if understanding them could change how we live today. The students found him fascinating and slightly disturbing. He paced while lecturing, gesturing wildly, sometimes closing his eyes as if seeing visions. He assigned unconventional readings, connecting ancient texts to modern philosophy in ways that made conservative faculty members nervous. But he was brilliant. Everyone agreed on that. Shortly after arriving in Basel, Friedrich's greatest wish came true. He was invited to meet Richard Wagner, who lived nearby in Tribschen on Lake Lucerne. Wagner was 55, famous, surrounded by admirers and drama. Friedrich was 24, unknown, trembling with nervous excitement. They met on May 15, 1869, and Friedrich left feeling he'd found his spiritual father. Wagner and his companion Cosima received Friedrich like a favored son. They invited him back repeatedly. He spent Christmases with them, listened to Wagner play piano, discussed philosophy and art for hours. Wagner was everything Friedrich thought a genius should be: larger than life, uncompromising, creating art that challenged everything safe and comfortable. For Friedrich, Wagner represented a possible future for culture. Not the dead weight of Christian morality, not the shallow optimism of modern science, but something primal and powerful, reconnecting with the Greek tragic spirit. He began planning a book about Greek tragedy, but really it was about Wagner, about the possibility of cultural renewal. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War erupted. Friedrich, still technically liable for military service, volunteered as a medical orderly. He spent weeks transporting wounded soldiers exposed to the full horror of war, men screaming, limbs shattered, the smell of gangrene and death. He contracted dysentery and diphtheria, barely survived, was sent home, broken in health. The experience scarred him. He'd seen nationalism's ugly reality, the waste of war, young men destroyed for abstract political goals. When Germany won and unified under Prussian leadership, everyone celebrated except Friedrich. He watched the triumphalism with growing disgust, seeing it as the victory of military power over culture. Back in Basel, recovering slowly, he finished his first book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, published in 1872. It was supposed to be a scholarly work about ancient Greek drama. Instead, it was a wild visionary manifesto arguing that Greek tragedy emerged from two opposing forces, the Apollonian, rational and ordered, and the Dionysian, chaotic and ecstatic. Modern culture, Friedrich argued, had lost the Dionysian element, become too rational, too safe. Wagner's operas could restore it. The academic world reacted with horror. This wasn't proper scholarship. Where were the footnotes, the careful arguments, the scholarly detachment? Friedrich's former colleagues savaged the book. One reviewer compared reading it to being attacked by a madman. His old professor Ritschl, who'd championed him, was deeply disappointed. Friedrich's academic career essentially ended before it really began. Students stopped enrolling in his classes. Basel kept him on, but his isolation was complete. He'd burned his bridges with the scholarly establishment, all for a book arguing that we needed to bring back the spirit of Greek tragedy through German opera. But he didn't care, or rather he cared deeply, felt the rejection painfully, but couldn't back down. He'd said what he believed to be true, and truth mattered more than respectability. This would become his pattern, saying uncomfortable things, being rejected, doubling down. The isolation hurt though, his health worsened, the headaches became more frequent, more severe. His eyesight deteriorated to the point where reading was agony. He spent days in darkened rooms, unable to work, tortured by pain and by thoughts. In the mid-1870s, Friedrich's life became a careful management of suffering. The migraines struck without warning, forcing him to lie in darkness for days. His stomach rebelled against most foods. His eyes burned if he read for more than an hour. Doctors prescribed remedies that didn't work. Cold baths, electrical treatments, changes of air, different diets. Nothing helped consistently. He requested leave from Basel repeatedly, spending months in Italy and Switzerland seeking climates that might ease his symptoms. He became a kind of intellectual nomad, moving from pension to pension, always searching for conditions that would let him think and write. His modest professor's salary and a small pension from Basel supported this wandering life. But Friedrich refused to be defeated by his body. When headaches made reading impossible, he walked for hours in the mountains, thinking through problems until solutions emerged. When his eyes couldn't handle books, he dictated to friends or paid students to read to him. He developed an entire philosophy while essentially blind and in constant pain. His relationship with Wagner began souring during this period. The turning point came in 1876 when the first Bayreuth Festival opened to celebrate Wagner's completed Ring Cycle. Friedrich attended with high hopes, expecting a cultural revolution. Instead, he found a circus. The Kaiser attended, German nationalists treated it like a political rally. Fashionable society people came to be seen rather than to experience art. Wagner himself had changed, or perhaps Friedrich was finally seeing clearly. The great artist had become a celebrity obsessed with his own importance, surrounded by sycophants. Worse, Wagner was working on Parsifal, an opera celebrating Christian redemption. To Friedrich, this felt like betrayal. Wagner was supposed to be reviving pagan Greek tragedy, not crawling back to Christianity. Friedrich left Bayreuth early, claiming illness which wasn't entirely a lie. But the real sickness was disillusionment. He'd projected his own hopes onto Wagner, seen in him a cultural savior who would lead humanity beyond Christian morality. But Wagner was just a talented composer with a big ego and conventional prejudices. The break became permanent over the following years, though they never explicitly ended the friendship. Friedrich stopped visiting, stopped writing admiring letters. Wagner probably noticed, but was too busy being Wagner to care much. For Friedrich, it was another death, losing the spiritual father he'd chosen after losing his biological father as a child. During these painful years, Friedrich wrote a series of books that began articulating his mature philosophy. Human, All Too Human appeared in 1878, dedicated ironically to Voltaire rather than Wagner. It was written in aphorisms, short bursts of insight rather than systematic argument, partly because his health made sustained writing impossible. The book attacked romantic idealism, religious faith, and Wagner's art without naming him directly. It praised science, reason, and cold analysis of human nature. Critics complained it was too cynical, too negative, lacking in proper German idealism. Friedrich's few remaining friends worried he'd become bitter, but something else was emerging beneath the cynicism. Friedrich was clearing ground, tearing down the old structures of thought so something new could grow. He was teaching himself to think without the comfort of religious or metaphysical certainties, to face reality without flinching. It was brutal work, and it showed. His health continued deteriorating. In 1879, he resigned from Basel, unable to teach anymore. At 34, his academic career was over. The university granted him a modest pension, enough to survive on if he lived simply. He became a full-time wanderer, moving through boarding houses in northern Italy, the Swiss Alps and the French Riviera, always chasing good air and enough peace to work. Friends worried he was becoming a hermit, but Friedrich saw it differently. He was free now, free from teaching duties, free from academic politics, free from social obligations. All he had to do was think and write and survive. Simple, except for the constant pain and isolation and poverty. The early 1880s found Friedrich living like a monk, but instead of serving God, he served his own thoughts. He moved seasonally between summer in the Swiss mountains around Sils Maria and winters on the Italian Riviera near Genoa and Nice. His routine became almost ritualistic. Rising early, cold baths, long walks, frugal meals, writing when his health allowed, reading when his eyes could bear it. He lived in cheap boarding houses, his possessions fitting in a single trunk. He ate simply, often alone, his sensitive stomach making social dining difficult. Landladies found him strange but harmless, this polite German gentleman with the enormous moustache who kept to himself and rarely complained despite obvious suffering. But Friedrich wasn't just enduring, he was transforming. The pain and isolation were burning away everything inessential, leaving only the core of his thinking. He began to see his suffering not as curse, but as gift, as the price of deeper insight. Those who never suffer, he thought, never understand life's true nature. In 1882, something unexpected happened. He fell in love. Her name was Lou Andreas Salome, a brilliant 21-year-old Russian woman studying philosophy in Rome. Friedrich met her through mutual friends and was immediately captivated. She was intellectually fearless, beautiful, completely uninterested in conventional female roles. She wanted to study philosophy, not get married. Friedrich proposed to her twice. She refused both times, kindly but firmly. She liked him, enjoyed their conversations, but didn't love him romantically. Instead, she suggested they form an intellectual partnership, with their mutual friend Paul Rée, living together platonically to pursue philosophy and writing. For a few months, this strange arrangement seemed possible. The three of them discussed philosophy, planned a life of shared intellectual work. There's a famous photograph from that summer showing Lou in a cart with a whip, while Friedrich and Paul pretend to pull it. Everyone's laughing, but the image would later haunt Friedrich. The arrangement collapsed by autumn. Friedrich's sister Elizabeth, who'd appointed herself guardian of his reputation, despised Lou and poisoned relationships with gossip and interference. Paul Rée fell genuinely in love with Lou. Friedrich's feelings were confused, mixing intellectual admiration with romantic longing and wounded pride. By winter, Lou had left with Rée, and Friedrich was alone again. The rejection devastated him. His letters from this period reveal raw pain and humiliation. He'd opened himself emotionally in ways he rarely allowed, and been rejected. He took heavy doses of opium to sleep, contemplated suicide, wrote bitter letters he later regretted. But from this darkness came creative explosion. In just 10 days during January 1883, he wrote the first part of his most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It poured out of him like a fever dream, written at white heat in a small Italian seaside village. Zarathustra wasn't philosophy in any conventional sense. It was poetry, prophecy, scripture for a godless age. The title character was based on the ancient Persian prophet Zoroaster, but Friedrich's Zarathustra was different. He descended from the mountains not to bring God's word, but to declare God dead and teach humanity how to live without divine guidance. The book's opening was stark and beautiful. Zarathustra comes down from a decade of solitude in the mountains, wanting to share his wisdom. He encounters an old hermit still praying in the forest. After they part, Zarathustra realizes, could it be possible? This old saint in the forest has not yet heard that God is dead. That phrase, God is dead, would become Friedrich's most famous statement, though most people misunderstand it. He wasn't celebrating, he was diagnosing. European culture had been built on Christian foundations for over 1,000 years. Now those foundations were crumbling, undermined by science, reason, and modernity. God was dead in the sense that educated Europeans no longer truly believed, even if they kept going through the motions. The question was, what comes next? If there's no God, no divine plan, no objective morality handed down from heaven, what do we do? Most people, Friedrich thought, would fall into nihilism, believing nothing matters. But Zarathustra taught a different path. Create your own values, become who you truly are, say yes to life. Thus Spoke Zarathustra appeared in 4 parts between 1883 and 1885, and almost nobody noticed. Friedrich paid for publication himself. Bookshops didn't stock it, reviewers ignored it. His publisher printed 40 copies of the 4th part and sold 7. It was one of the great masterpieces of German literature, and it landed with a thud. Friedrich tried not to care, but of course he did. He'd poured his heart into this book, written it in a state of inspiration he described as almost supernatural. And the world responded with silence. Friends who bothered reading it found it strange, too poetic, too weird to be proper philosophy. But Friedrich believed in Zarathustra with religious intensity. He called it his gift to humanity, predicted it would split history in 2, compared it to holy texts. This wasn't ego, or not just ego. He genuinely believed he'd discovered something crucial about human existence and found a way to express it that bypassed rational argument to hit deeper. The book introduced several ideas that would define Friedrich's philosophy. The Superman, or Overman, often mistranslated from the German Übermensch, was his vision of humanity's next stage. Not a biological evolution, but a psychological one, individuals who could create their own values without needing God's permission. The eternal recurrence was another key idea. Imagine you had to live your exact life over and over forever. every pain and every joy repeating infinitely. Could you say yes to that? Could you love your life that much? This wasn't meant as literal cosmology, but as a test. If the thought horrifies you, you're not living authentically. And the will to power, often misunderstood as simple domination, was Friedrich's alternative to Schopenhauer's will to live. Life, Friedrich argued, isn't primarily about survival or reproduction. It's about growth, expansion, overcoming obstacles, becoming stronger. Everything alive wants to increase its power, and morality should acknowledge this, instead of pretending we're all selfless angels. These ideas were explosive, dangerous in the wrong hands, as history would prove. But Friedrich wasn't advocating for political domination or military conquest. He was talking about psychological strength, spiritual independence, the courage to create meaning in a meaningless universe. Through the mid-1880s, he continued his nomadic existence, moving between mountains and Mediterranean coast, writing feverishly when health permitted. He worked on Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, which laid out his critique of traditional morality more systematically than Zarathustra's poetry had done. The basic argument was simple but radical. Our moral concepts aren't timeless truths but historical inventions reflecting specific power relationships. The ancient Greeks and Romans had a master morality, celebrating strength, pride, and self-assertion. Christianity invented a slave morality that called these qualities evil and made virtues of weakness, humility, and self-denial. Friedrich wasn't saying master morality was better in some objective sense. He was saying we should recognize that morality is human creation, not divine command. Once we see this, we're free to evaluate moral codes pragmatically. Do they enhance life or diminish it? Christianity, he argued, diminished life by making people ashamed of their natural instincts. The book sold poorly, like everything he wrote. Friedrich's mother and sister, still conventionally religious, were horrified by his attacks on Christianity. His few remaining friends worried he'd gone too far, alienating potential readers with his aggressive tone. But Friedrich was past caring about sales or respectability. His health was getting worse. He knew he might not have many years left. He needed to say everything while he still could, needed to get his ideas out before his body completely failed him. In 1887, he published On the Genealogy of Morals, a more focused attack on Christian morality's historical development. It traced how concepts like guilt and bad conscience emerged, arguing they were tools the weak used to control the strong. The analysis was brilliant and disturbing, showing how deeply psychology and morality intertwine. He also worked on several other projects simultaneously, unable to focus on one thing because ideas kept flooding in faster than he could write them down. His notebooks from this period are chaotic, filled with fragments, aphorisms, outlines for books he'd never complete. By 1888, Friedrich was living in Turin, Italy, and something was changing. His health seemed better temporarily, his mood elevated, his productivity extraordinary. In a single year, he wrote 5 books, each one sharper and more aggressive than the last. He walked the arcaded streets of Turin for hours, eating ice cream, feeling inspired by the city's clear air and elegant architecture. The first book was The Case of Wagner, finally attacking his former idol directly. It was brutal, personal, mocking Wagner's pretensions and his late conversion to Christian themes. Wagner had died 5 years earlier, so couldn't defend himself, which made Friedrich's attack seem petty to some readers. But for Friedrich, it was necessary exorcism, killing the father figure once and for all. Then came Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer. The title announced Friedrich's intentions. Smash the old idols, the false gods humanity has worshipped. He attacked Socrates and Plato for inventing the idea that the real world is somewhere else, not this one. He mocked German culture, Christian morality, and democratic values. His tone was gleeful, energized, sometimes unhinged. The Antichrist went even further, a sustained demolition of Christianity as a system built on ressentiment, the French word for a kind of bitter, repressed hatred of life and strength. Jesus himself, Friedrich suggested, might have been okay, but Christianity, as Paul invented it, was a disaster for humanity. It taught people to deny life, despise the body, fear their own strength. Reading these books today, they still have power to shock and disturb. Friedrich wrote with a kind of possessed urgency, as if running out of time. His sentences are like whips, designed to sting and awaken. He wanted to provoke, to shake readers out of comfortable assumptions, to make them question everything they'd been taught. His final book, written in just 3 days in mid-October, was Ecce Homo, an autobiography with chapter titles like Why I Am So Wise and Why I Write Such Good Books. It should have been embarrassing vanity, but it's actually fascinating, strange, and funny. Friedrich was assessing his own work, explaining his ideas clearly for once, predicting his future impact. But the tone was worrying. The grandiosity seemed excessive even for Friedrich. He compared himself to Jesus and Buddha, claimed his Zarathustra was the deepest book ever written, predicted he would split human history into before and after. Friends who received letters from him that fall noticed something was off. The handwriting was shakier, the ideas more grandiose, the mood swinging wildly. On January 3rd, 1889, something broke. Friedrich was walking in Turin's Piazza Carlo Alberto when he saw a coachman beating a horse. He ran to the horse, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed, sobbing. Neighbors helped him back to his lodgings, where he alternated between piano playing, singing, and making strange statements. Over the following days, he sent bizarre letters to friends, to his old Basel colleague, Jacob Burckhardt. I am every name in history. To Cosima Wagner. Ariadne, I love you. He signed some letters, Dionysus, and others, the crucified one. He claimed to have ordered the Kaiser arrested and asked all anti-Semites to be shot. His landlord, terrified, contacted Friedrich's friend, Franz Overbeck, in Basel. Overbeck rushed to Turin, found Friedrich in a state of complete mental collapse, and brought him back to Switzerland. Doctors examined him, diagnosed progressive paralysis, and admitted him to a psychiatric clinic. Friedrich Nietzsche's productive intellectual life was over. He was 44 years old. He'd spent a decade in increasing isolation and pain, producing works of genius that almost nobody read. And now his mind, which had been his only wealth, what happened to Friedrich Nietzsche's mind remains debated. The official diagnosis in 1889 was tertiary syphilis, the late stage where the disease attacks the brain. This made sense given his symptoms: grandiosity, confusion, eventual dementia. Syphilis was common in 19th century Europe, often contracted decades before symptoms appeared, but some scholars question this diagnosis. Friedrich lived a relatively celibate life. There's only one documented visit to a brothel in his youth in Cologne in 1865, where he claimed nothing happened. The alternative theories include brain tumor, genetic mental illness, or some combination of factors. We'll never know for certain. What's clear is that from January 1889 until his death in 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche existed in a kind of twilight state. He spent several months in clinics, then his mother brought him home to Naumburg to care for him. He recognized people sometimes, other times seemed lost in his own world. He played piano occasionally, always the same few pieces. He looked at books without reading them. The man who'd advocated for psychological strength and self-overcoming was now completely dependent on others. The philosopher who'd declared God dead and celebrated life needed constant care like an infant. The irony was cruel and obvious. His mother Franziska cared for him until her death in 1897, treating him like a child again. She never understood his philosophy, never read his books properly, still saw him as her little pastor who'd gone astray. She was kind but confused by what had happened to her brilliant son. After Franziska's death, Friedrich's sister Elizabeth took over. This was perhaps the worst thing that could have happened to his legacy. Elizabeth was conventional, conservative, married to an anti-Semitic nationalist. She'd always resented her brother's unconventional views and his friendship with people she considered inappropriate, especially Lou Salome. Elizabeth moved her brother to Weimar, establishing the Nietzsche archive and appointing herself guardian of his intellectual legacy. But she didn't just preserve his work, she manipulated it. She edited his unpublished notebook selectively, creating a book called The Will to Power that presented Friedrich as a proto-fascist philosopher supporting German nationalism and anti-Semitism. This was almost exactly opposite to Friedrich's actual views. He despised German nationalism, called anti-Semites Kanaille, rabble, and had broken with friends over their anti-Semitic attitudes. But Elizabeth, now a widow whose husband's anti-Semitic colony in Paraguay had failed spectacularly, needed to rehabilitate the family name. She turned her brother into a respectable German philosopher. The timing was terrible. Germany was moving toward the nationalism and militarism that would lead to World War I. Elizabeth's edited version of Friedrich's philosophy, with its talk of Superman and will to power stripped of context, fit perfectly with these dangerous trends. Intellectuals and politicians started citing Nietzsche to justify German superiority and aggressive foreign policy. Meanwhile, Friedrich himself sat in his rooms in Weimar, oblivious to all this. Visitors came to see the famous philosopher, tourists essentially, and found a docile man with an enormous moustache who stared blankly or occasionally smiled. Elizabeth charged admission, showing off her famous brother like an exhibit. Max Weber, the sociologist, visited and found the whole scene grotesque. Here was one of the 19th century's greatest minds reduced to a breathing shell, while his sister profited from distorted versions of his ideas. Other visitors came seeking wisdom and left disturbed by the silent figure in the chair. Friedrich Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900, from pneumonia and probably another stroke. He was 55 years old. He'd spent the last 11 years of his life in various states of confusion and dementia, unable to recognize himself in the books he'd written. The 20th century was just beginning, the century that would take his ideas and run wild with them in ways he'd have hated. His funeral in Röcken, the small village where he'd been born, was conventional and religious despite everything he'd written against Christianity. Pastors spoke over his body. His mother and sister arranged everything according to proper Lutheran tradition. It would have made him laugh or weep, this final irony. But even as Friedrich's body was laid to rest, his ideas were just beginning their strange journey through history. In the early 1900s, his popularity exploded. Everyone suddenly wanted to read this philosopher who'd been ignored during his productive life. The Zarathustra that sold 40 copies now went through printing after printing. Unfortunately, many early readers got him filtered through Elizabeth's distortions. The Will to Power, which he compiled from his notebooks, became his most famous work, even though he'd never organized it that way. She emphasized passages about power and strength while downplaying his critiques of German culture and nationalism. During World War I, German soldiers carried Zarathustra in their packs alongside the Bible. Generals quoted Nietzsche on overcoming obstacles and having the courage to seize victory. This was absurd on multiple levels. Friedrich had hated militarism, despised nationalism, and seen war up close during his medical service in 1870. He'd been horrified. After Germany's defeat, the political right kept claiming Friedrich as their philosopher. The Nazis, emerging in the 1920s, loved his Superman concept, his criticisms of democracy, his talk of strength and power. Alfred Bäumler, a Nazi philosopher, gave lectures presenting Nietzsche as proto-fascist, prophet of the Third Reich. Elizabeth encouraged this interpretation because she was a Nazi sympathizer herself. She gave Hitler her brother's walking stick as a gift. Hitler visited the archive multiple times, posed for photos next to Friedrich's bust. Nazi propaganda films used Nietzsche quotes over images of marching soldiers and tank battalions. This association nearly destroyed Friedrich's reputation permanently. After World War II, many intellectuals dismissed him as the philosopher whose ideas led to Auschwitz. This was profoundly unfair. Friedrich had explicitly rejected anti-Semitism, had Jewish friends, had praised Jewish contributions to European culture. He'd attacked nationalism and militarism repeatedly, but guilt by association is powerful. Some post-war German thinkers wanted nothing to do with any philosopher the Nazis had claimed. The Anglo-American philosophical world, already suspicious of continental philosophy's literary style, mostly ignored him. Nietzsche became taboo. The rehabilitation began slowly. Scholars started working with his original texts, showing how Elizabeth had distorted his ideas. Walter Kaufmann's English translations in the 1950s and 60s presented Friedrich more accurately, emphasizing his psychological insights and cultural criticisms rather than political implications. The French intellectuals rediscovered him in the 1960s and 70s. Foucault, Derrida, and Deleuze found in Friedrich's work tools for critiquing power structures and questioning taken-for-granted truths. They appreciated his genealogical method, his way of showing that things we consider natural and eternal actually have historical origins and serve specific purposes. Existentialists like Camus had been reading him for years, finding in his emphasis on creating meaning despite life's absurdity a kindred spirit. Nietzsche's insistence that we must say yes to life, even knowing it's tragic, resonated with post-war intellectuals trying to rebuild meaning after the catastrophe. By the 1970s and 80s, Friedrich was everywhere in academic philosophy and cultural theory. Literary critics used his ideas about perspective and interpretation. Psychologists found his insights into motivation and self-deception prescient. Even scientists interested in evolution and biology discovered he'd anticipated some of their ideas about power and adaptation. But what did Friedrich Nietzsche actually believe? Let's set aside the distortions and misuses and get to the core of his thought. It's simpler than it seems, though not easy. First, God is dead. Not that God never existed or that Friedrich proved God doesn't exist. He meant that European culture had been built on Christian foundations, but modernity, science, and reason had made traditional belief impossible for educated people. We might still go to church, still mouth the words, but the deep conviction was gone. This was a cultural diagnosis, not a celebration. Friedrich saw that most people hadn't realized the implications yet. They thought they could keep Christian morality, the ideas that life is sacred, that we're all equal, that suffering is redemptive, that humility is good, without believing in the God who supposedly commanded these values. But where do values come from if not from God? Friedrich's answer: from us. Humans create values, always have. We just pretended they came from heaven to give them authority. Different cultures create different values because different things help different groups survive and thrive. The ancient Greeks valued pride, excellence, and physical prowess because these helped them win wars and build great city-states. Christians valued humility, charity, and forgiveness because these helped small persecuted communities survive. Neither morality is objectively true, they're tools humans created for specific purposes. Once we understand this, we face what Friedrich called nihilism, the realization that there's no objective meaning or morality. This is the great crisis of modernity. Most people will respond to nihilism badly, he thought. They'll fall into despair, or embrace scientific materialism that makes life meaningless, or retreat into new false gods like nationalism or socialism. But there's another path, creating your own values consciously, with open eyes. Oh, this is what the Superman represents, not a biological superior, but someone psychologically strong enough to make meaning without divine permission. Someone who can say, "This is what I value, this is who I choose to be," without needing to believe it's mandated by nature or God. The eternal recurrence idea tests whether you're living authentically. If you had to live your exact life over and over forever, would you? If not, what needs to change? It forces you to evaluate your choices, to live in a way you can fully affirm. The will to power is Friedrich's answer to what drives life. Not survival, not reproduction, but growth and self-overcoming. Everything alive wants to expand, to become stronger, to realize its potential. This isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself, overcoming your limitations, becoming who you truly are. Master morality and slave morality were his analysis of how different moral systems emerge. Master morality comes from positions of strength, celebrating qualities like courage, pride, and nobility. Slave morality emerges from positions of weakness, making virtues of things like humility, patience, and meekness, because that's all the weak have. Christianity represented slave morality's triumph, convincing even the strong to feel ashamed of their strength, guilty about their power, obligated to serve the weak. This produced what Friedrich called the herd mentality, everyone the same, mediocre, no one striving for excellence because that would be prideful. Friedrich wasn't saying we should go back to ancient morality or abandon compassion. He was saying we should think clearly about values, recognize their human origins, and consciously create moralities that enhance life rather than diminish it. His attack on Christianity wasn't personal, it was philosophical. He thought Christian values, whatever their historical usefulness, now prevented human flourishing. The emphasis on sin and guilt, the celebration of suffering, the promise of afterlife that devalued this life, all this made people weak, ashamed, afraid of their own strength. What would a life-affirming morality look like? Friedrich never spelled it out completely because he thought each person must create their own, but the hints are there. Embrace life fully, including its suffering. Cultivate strength, both physical and psychological. Take responsibility for your choices. Create meaning through your actions. Say yes to your fate, even when it's hard. The phrase "God is dead" has been quoted and misquoted so often that it's lost its original power and context. Let's look at what Friedrich actually wrote, how he framed this diagnosis, and what he thought it meant for humanity. The most famous version appears in The Gay Science, published in 1882. Friedrich puts the words in the mouth of a madman who runs into a marketplace in the morning, lighting a lantern even though the sun is shining, shouting, "I seek God, I seek God." The people in the marketplace laugh at him. They're atheists, not believers, so they mock. Has God gotten lost? Did he lose his way like a child? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, emigrated? But the madman isn't joking. He confronts them with a question. "Where has God gone? I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." Then comes the famous passage. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The madman goes on to describe the magnitude of what's happened. We've unchained the earth from its sun. We're straying through infinite nothing, empty space breathing at us. It's getting colder, night and more night coming. This isn't celebration, it's terror. The madman sees something the casual atheists don't. Losing God isn't just losing a hypothesis about the universe's origin, it's losing the framework that gave meaning to everything, the foundation of value, purpose, and morality for 1,000 years. The madman smashes his lantern on the ground and says, "I come too early. My time has not yet come. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men." Friedrich was describing his own situation. He'd realized the implications of God's death, but most people, even atheists, hadn't. They thought they could keep living basically the same while just not going to church. They didn't see that everything needed rethinking. In another passage, Friedrich described God's death as like the sun disappearing. For a while, we can navigate by its light even after it's gone, the way light takes time to travel through space. But eventually the darkness will arrive, and we'll have to navigate by other means. What dies with God isn't just religious belief, it's the whole structure of meaning built on that belief. If there's no God, there's no divine plan, no ultimate purpose, no cosmic justice, no afterlife to balance earthly suffering, no objective morality written into the universe's fabric. For 1,000 years, Europeans got their values from Christianity. Be humble. Love your neighbor. The meek shall inherit the earth. Suffering is redemptive. The body is fallen, but the soul eternal. This life is just preparation for the next. Take away God, and these values lose their foundation. Why should we be humble if no one's watching? Why love our neighbor if there's no reward? Why see suffering as meaningful if it's just pain? Why value soul over body if the soul doesn't exist? Most people's response, Friedrich predicted, would be to keep the values while forgetting their source. We still act as if life is sacred, as if everyone has equal worth, as if suffering should be minimized. But why, if we're just biological machines, temporary arrangements of atoms, why treat each life as infinitely valuable? Friedrich called this nihilism, not in the casual sense of believing nothing matters, but in the philosophical sense of values losing their foundation. The old values are collapsing, but new ones haven't emerged yet. We're in between, and it's dangerous. Some people would respond to nihilism with despair, giving up on meaning entirely. Others would grab onto new false gods, nationalism, socialism, scientism, whatever offers certainty and purpose. But these are just God substitutes, trying to fill the void with something equally absolute. The proper response, Friedrich argued, was to acknowledge God's death honestly and then build new values consciously. Not pretend the old values still have divine sanction, not embrace meaninglessness, but create meaning deliberately, taking full responsibility for our choices. Friedrich's concept of the Superman, or Overman, is probably his most misunderstood idea. The German word Übermensch means literally overman or beyond man, someone who has gone beyond current humanity. It's not about biology but psychology, not about physical superiority but spiritual strength. The Superman emerges in response to God's death. With no divine command telling us how to live, we face a choice: collapse into nihilism or become creators of our own values. The Superman chooses creation. He's someone strong enough psychologically to make meaning without cosmic permission. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, this concept gets introduced through striking imagery. Zarathustra comes down from the mountains and tells the people, "I teach you the Superman. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him?" He describes 3 transformations of the spirit. First, the camel, who kneels to take on heavy loads, accepting the values and commands given by tradition and authority. "What is heavy?" the camel asks, wanting to be loaded down with duties and obligations. Then the camel becomes a lion in the desert, who says, "I will," instead of "thou shalt." The lion fights against the dragon of tradition, whose scales are inscribed with ancient values, "thou shalt." The lion's sacred no creates freedom from old values. But the lion cannot create new values, only destroy old ones. So finally, the lion must become a child, who plays innocently, creates without guilt or second thoughts, says yes to life. The child can create new values, new meanings, new ways of being. The Superman represents this child stage, someone who has passed through destruction to creation, not someone who follows old rules or simply rebels against them, but someone who makes new rules consciously and joyfully. Friedrich was careful not to specify exactly what the Superman would value because that would defeat the point. Each person must become their own Superman, create their own meaning, but he dropped hints about the general direction. The Superman affirms life completely, including suffering and uncertainty. He doesn't need consolation or promises of better worlds elsewhere. He says yes to this world, this life, exactly as it is, eternally recurring if necessary. The Superman overcomes himself constantly. He doesn't rest on achievements, but keeps growing, keeps challenging himself, keeps becoming. Comfort and security are traps. The goal is always to surpass yesterday's self. The Superman takes full responsibility for his existence, no blaming God, fate, society, or psychology for his choices. He creates himself deliberately like an artist creating a masterpiece. His life is his artwork. The Superman is not cruel or domineering. Friedrich specifically rejected the idea that being strong means crushing the weak. Real strength means self-mastery, not domination of others. The Superman is generous not from obligation, but from overflow of vitality. But here's where things get complicated, because Friedrich also wrote passages that seem to glorify hardness and cruelty, that dismiss compassion as weakness, that mock democracy and equality. The Nazis cherry-pick these passages to justify their ideology. The truth is, Friedrich's thinking about power and strength was complex and sometimes contradictory. He valued compassion but not pity, which he saw as degrading to both giver and receiver. He praised strength but meant psychological resilience, not military force. He criticized democracy and mass culture, preferring aristocratic individuals who dare to be different. But he wasn't advocating for political aristocracy or racial hierarchies. He was talking about spiritual aristocracy, people who refuse to settle for mediocrity. The Superman is individualistic but not isolated. Friedrich imagined communities of strong individuals, friends who challenge each other to greater heights, not lonely strongmen dominating herds of weaklings. Unfortunately, this ideal was easy to pervert. Take away the self-overcoming and keep the strength talk, and you get justification for fascism. Replace psychological power with political power, and you get authoritarianism. Read metaphors literally, and you get racial supremacy theories. The eternal recurrence is perhaps Friedrich's strangest and most powerful idea. It appears in several works, but most vividly in The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The basic thought experiment goes like this. What if you had to live your life exactly as you've lived it over and over for eternity? Or not reincarnation where you come back as something else, not heaven or hell as reward or punishment, just this life, this exact sequence of moments repeating forever. Every joy, every pain, every triumph and humiliation, every mundane moment, all of it again and again with no variation. In The Gay Science, Friedrich frames it as a question. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. How would you respond? Would you throw yourself down and curse the demon? Or would you answer, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? The eternal recurrence isn't meant as literal cosmology, though Friedrich sometimes toyed with physical arguments for why it might be true. It's a test of how you're living. If the thought of living your life again horrifies you, something's wrong. You're not living authentically, not affirming your choices. Imagine facing eternity's recurrence of your most embarrassing moment, your deepest shame, your greatest suffering. Can you say yes, even to that? Can you love your life so completely that you'd want nothing changed? Most people couldn't pass this test. We live with regrets, thinking, if only I'd done things differently. We endure the present, hoping for a better future. We see our suffering as meaningless waste. The thought of eternal recurrence would crush us. But the Superman could pass the test. He affirms his life completely, including its suffering. He takes full responsibility for his choices, so has no regrets. He doesn't live for some future reward, but finds meaning in each moment. He could face eternity's recurrence and say yes. This idea connects to another of Friedrich's concepts, amor fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance, but active affirmation of everything that happens. Not just tolerating suffering, but embracing it as necessary to who you are. Friedrich himself struggled with this ideal while writing about it. His life was filled with pain, illness, rejection, loneliness. Could he really say yes to eternal recurrence of his migraines, his failed relationships, his ignored books? In Exe Homo, he claimed he could. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it. But this was written at the edge of madness, in that manic last year, before his collapse. Whether he truly achieved amor fati or just convinced himself he had, is unknowable. The ideal might be impossible, something to strive toward, knowing you'll never fully reach it. The eternal recurrence also has temporal implications. If everything recurs, then past and future are illusions. Everything that will happen has already happened infinitely many times. This creates a kind of eternal present, where each moment is all moments. This thought can be paralyzing or liberating depending on perspective. Paralyzing because nothing we do ultimately matters if it just repeats. Liberating because each moment matters infinitely since it recurs eternally. Friedrich clearly intended it as liberating, as a way to intensify the present moment. If this moment will recur eternally, then give it everything, live it fully. Make it worthy of eternal repetition. And slave morality are Friedrich's contribution to understanding how different moral systems develop. This is genealogy, the method of tracing concepts back to their origins to understand their purpose and function. It's one of his most influential ideas, picked up by later thinkers from Foucault to contemporary evolutionary psychologists. The basic distinction appears most clearly in Beyond Good and Evil and on the genealogy of morals. Master morality originates from positions of strength and power. The nobles, warriors, aristocrats create values reflecting their own condition. They call themselves good, meaning proud, strong, noble, excellent. Everything else is bad, meaning weak, common, low, despicable. Notice that master morality's opposite of good isn't evil, but bad, meaning inferior or contemptible. There's no deep moral judgment, just aristocratic distinction between the excellent and the mediocre. The masters feel good about themselves naturally. They don't need to compare themselves to others or measure up to external standards. They set the standards. Their values come from self-affirmation, from confidence in their own excellence. Slave morality emerges from positions of weakness and resentment. The slaves, the conquered, the powerless, cannot compete on the master's terms. They're not strong, not noble, not proud, so they invent different values where their weakness becomes virtue. The slave's key move is making good mean humble, meek, patient, suffering. And they invent evil to describe the master's qualities: pride, strength, self-assertion. Notice the shift from bad, inferior, to evil, morally wrong. The slaves turn inequality into injustice, transform power differences into moral judgments. This is what Friedrich called ressentiment, French for a kind of bitter, repressed hatred. The slaves can't attack the masters directly, so they attack through moral judgment. They make the masters feel guilty for being strong, ashamed of their excellence. Christianity, according to Friedrich, represents slave morality's ultimate triumph. It's the revolt of the weak against the strong, transvaluing all values. What the nobles called good, Christians call evil. Pride is sin. What the nobles call bad, Christians call good. Blessed are the meek. The genius of Christianity is making this inversion seem like cosmic truth rather than human invention. God commands humility, not human weakness, inventing excuses. God hates pride, not slaves resenting strength. The moral order gets projected onto the universe itself. Over centuries, Christian values conquered Europe so completely that even the strong internalized them. Nobles felt guilty about their power, the wealthy felt they should serve the poor. Excellence became suspect, humility became ideal. Master morality went underground. But Friedrich wasn't simply praising master morality and condemning slave morality. His analysis was more complex. He recognized that slave morality led to important developments in consciousness, depth of soul, psychological sophistication. The nobles were perhaps more vital, but less deep. What he objected to was the universalization of slave morality, the pretense that Christian values are objective truth rather than one group's values winning out historically. And he objected to values that diminish life, make people weak, ashamed, guilty for existing. His vision wasn't returning to ancient master morality, but going beyond both, creating new values consciously. Values that affirm life without needing to crush others. Values that celebrate strength without despising weakness. Values that encourage excellence without guilt. But the distinction between master and slave morality gave later thinkers powerful analytical tools. It shows how morality reflects power relationships, how the powerless use moral concepts as weapons, how what seems natural and eternal actually has historical origins. Modern democracy bothered Friedrich partly because he saw it as slave morality become political system. Equality as ideal, majority rule, suspicion of excellence, resentment of the exceptional. Everyone reduced to the same level, mediocrity celebrated, greatness made uncomfortable. Friedrich's relationship with truth is complex and has become enormously influential in contemporary philosophy. He's sometimes called the first postmodernist, though that term didn't exist in his lifetime. His skepticism about objective truth laid groundwork for later thinkers questioning absolute knowledge. In his early work, Friedrich accepted something like truth in a conventional sense. But over time, he became increasingly suspicious. Not that nothing is true, but that truth is a more complicated concept than we usually think. One of his most famous statements appears in Beyond Good and Evil. Suppose truth is a woman, what then? He goes on to suggest that philosophers have been clumsy suitors, too certain they could possess truth through force of logic. But maybe truth is more elusive, more particular, more perspectival than they assumed. The perspectivism that Friedrich developed says that all knowledge is from some perspective, shaped by the knower's interests and situation. There's no view from nowhere, no pure objective standpoint. When we claim to know truth, we're really describing how things appear from our particular angle. This doesn't mean all perspectives are equally valid or that truth is just whatever anyone says. Some perspectives are broader, more comprehensive, more useful than others. But we can never escape perspective entirely to reach pure objective truth. Friedrich applied this to morality especially. There's no moral truth written into the universe, just different moral perspectives reflecting different needs and power relationships. The masters see the world one way, the slaves another. Neither is objectively true. But perspectivism goes deeper. Even in science, supposedly objective knowledge reflects human interests and capacities. We measure things we can measure, care about regularities we can exploit, frame questions in ways our minds can handle. Our knowledge is shaped by what we are. This led Friedrich to question whether truth is even a value worth pursuing. Maybe useful fictions serve us better than harsh truths. Maybe the truth that life is meaningless would paralyze us, while life-enhancing illusions help us flourish. In The Gay Science, he wrote, we simply lack any organ for knowledge for truth. We know precisely as much as may be useful in the interest of the human herd, the species. This raises uncomfortable questions. If truth is just useful fiction, then why should we care about it? Why not embrace whatever beliefs help us thrive? Isn't that exactly what Friedrich accused Christianity of doing, choosing comforting lies over harsh realities? His response was subtle. We should be honest about our dishonesty, aware that our truths are perspectival and serve purposes. The problem with Christianity isn't that it's useful fiction, but that it pretends to be absolute truth. Self-aware perspectivism is better than unconscious dogmatism. This influenced later philosophy enormously. Pragmatists like William James developed the idea that truth means what works. Continental philosophers like Foucault explored how power shapes what counts as knowledge. Postmodernists questioned grand narratives and absolute truth claims. But Friedrich's position shouldn't be confused with simple relativism, the idea that all beliefs are equally valid. He clearly thought some perspectives were better than others, some ways of thinking more honest, some approaches more life-affirming. His genealogical method tries to reveal hidden origins of concepts we take for granted. By showing that our truths have historical sources and serve particular purposes, he doesn't make them false, but shows their human constructions rather than eternal verities. Take the concept of free will. Friedrich argued it's a fiction invented to make people feel guilty, to justify punishment and blame. The supposedly free agent who could have chosen otherwise is held morally responsible. But if will isn't free, if we're products of heredity and environment, then punishment becomes problematic. Does showing this make free will false? Not exactly. The concept still functions socially, but understanding its origins and purposes helps us see it as human invention rather than metaphysical fact. Friedrich's attack on Christianity was central to his philosophy and remains controversial. He wasn't just an atheist. Many philosophers were atheists. He was specifically anti-Christian in a way that went beyond not believing to active opposition. His objection wasn't primarily to Christianity's factual claims, whether Jesus performed miracles or rose from the dead. It was to Christianity's values, which he saw as fundamentally anti-life, making people weak, guilty, and ashamed of their natural instincts. In The Antichrist, his most sustained attack, Friedrich argued that Christianity inverts healthy values. It makes weakness into virtue, blessed are the meek, suffering into blessing, blessed are those who mourn, and strength into vice, pride is sin. This systematic inversion poisons human flourishing. The concept of sin especially bothered him. Christianity teaches that we're fundamentally flawed, that our natural desires are sinful, that we need salvation from our own nature. This creates what Friedrich called bad conscience, a kind of self-torture where we internalize guilt and turn our strength against ourselves. Sexuality becomes shameful, pride becomes dangerous, anger becomes sinful, ambition becomes problematic. All the instincts that make us vital and alive get labeled as corruptions to overcome. The body becomes prison for the soul. This life becomes mere preparation for the next. The result, Friedrich argued, is weakness disguised as virtue. Christians celebrate humility not because humility is genuinely good, but because they lack the strength for pride. They praise suffering not because suffering is meaningful, but because they can't escape it and need to make it seem purposeful. This is slave morality crystallized into religion. The weak convince the strong to feel ashamed, to limit themselves, to serve others rather than develop their own excellence. Egalitarianism becomes highest value, not from justice, but from resentment of superiority. But Friedrich distinguished between Jesus and Christianity. Jesus himself, he suggested, might have been admirable, perhaps a kind of free spirit who taught love and rejected law. But Paul invented Christianity, transforming Jesus' teachings into a system of guilt, sin, and salvation. Paul's genius was making Christianity appeal to the masses by offering them spiritual equality to compensate for earthly inequality. Rich or poor, powerful or weak, all are equal before God. All are sinners needing salvation. The distinctions that matter in the world don't matter spiritually. This leveling effect, Friedrich thought, was Christianity's core appeal and its greatest danger. It offers comfort to the unsuccessful by making success spiritually suspect. The rich man has trouble entering heaven, the meek inherit the earth, the last shall be first. Over centuries, these values so thoroughly conquered Europe that even non-believers internalized them. Modern secular morality, with its emphasis on equality, compassion for suffering, suspicion of pride and power, is just Christianity without God. We kept the slave morality while forgetting its source. Friedrich wanted to revalue values, go beyond Christian morality to something life-affirming, not cruelty or selfishness, but a morality that celebrates strength, excellence, and vitality without guilt. A morality that says yes to life rather than preparing for death. His critique of Christianity influenced later thinkers enormously. Freud's analysis of guilt and civilization drew on Friedrich's insights. Foucault's studies of power and sexuality built on his genealogical approach. Even theologians had to grapple with his challenge. But the attack also made Friedrich many enemies. Conservative Germans saw him as dangerous nihilist. Christians obviously objected. Even some atheists thought he went too far, that Christianity had positive contributions despite its problems. The question remains, was Friedrich right? Is Christianity fundamentally anti-life? Or does it contain resources for human flourishing despite aspects he criticized? Different readers reach different conclusions. The will to power is Friedrich's answer to the fundamental question, what drives life? He rejected previous answers like Schopenhauer's will to live or Darwin's struggle for survival. Life, he argued, doesn't primarily aim at survival or reproduction, but at growth, expansion, overcoming resistance. The will to power appears throughout his later works, but never gets fully systematic treatment. This is partly because Friedrich died before completing his work, partly because he thought in aphorisms rather than systems. But the basic idea is clear enough. Every living thing wants to become stronger, to overcome obstacles, to expand its influence. This isn't conscious desire, but fundamental drive. Plants push toward light, animals compete for territory, humans strive for achievement. It's growth as life's basic principle. This goes deeper than survival instinct. Survival is just means to power, not end in itself. Many organisms risk survival for dominance, territory, or mates. They're not just trying to stay alive, but to grow stronger, more influential, more powerful. In humans, will to power takes psychological forms. We want mastery over ourselves, our environment, our circumstances. We want to overcome challenges, develop capabilities, achieve difficult goals. Even self-denial or asceticism can express will to power as self-mastery. Friedrich specifically rejected the idea that will to power means dominating others. That's a crude misunderstanding. The highest form of will to power is self-overcoming, mastering yourself, growing beyond your current limitations. The artist creating masterpiece, the thinker solving problem, the athlete pushing limits, all express will to power. Creativity is will to power. When artists create, they impose form on chaos, express inner vision, leave mark on world. Scientists discovering natural laws exercise will to power over nature. Philosophers developing new concepts expand humanity's conceptual power, but will to power can also manifest destructively. The tyrant dominating others, the bully crushing the weak, the conqueror destroying civilizations, also express will to power, just in inferior forms. Power over others is easier than power over self, but ultimately less satisfying. Morality itself reflects will to power. Different moral systems serve different power interests. Master morality affirms the strong's right to power. Slave morality is the weak's strategy for limiting the strong. Christian morality makes everyone feel guilty, equalizing through shared shame. Recognizing this doesn't make morality irrelevant. It just shows that moral claims are moves in power games rather than absolute truths. We can still prefer some moralities over others, but on grounds of what they enable rather than metaphysical truth. The concept influenced later thinkers in various fields. Psychologists like Adler built theories around drives for mastery and overcoming inferiority. Foucault analyzed how power operates in social systems. Even some evolutionary biologists saw connections to ideas about competition and dominance hierarchies. But the concept also enabled misuse. Nazi ideology took will to power, stripped away its subtlety about self-overcoming, and used it to justify aggressive militarism and racial hierarchy. This was travesty of Friedrich's meaning, but the language was there to be misused. Friedrich himself struggled with the concept's political implications. He despised German nationalism and militarism. He rejected anti-Semitism and racial theories. But his language about strength, power, and overcoming could be read as supporting these very things. This tension remains unresolved in his work. How do we celebrate strength without justifying domination? How do we value excellence without creating unjust hierarchies? How do we affirm will to power without enabling cruelty? Different readers answer differently. Some see Friedrich as proto-fascist despite intentions. Others see him as misunderstood individualist. Still others find resources in his work for progressive politics of self-creation and resistance to normalized oppression. What would Friedrich Nietzsche make of our contemporary world? We can only speculate. But his ideas remain surprisingly relevant to current debates about meaning, morality, and human nature. The death of God continues, perhaps more thoroughly than in his time. Church attendance in Europe has collapsed. Traditional religious belief keeps declining in developed nations. The Christian framework that structured Western culture for centuries is largely gone. But have we overcome nihilism? Friedrich would probably say no. We've lost traditional meaning without creating adequate replacements. People fill the void with consumerism, social media validation, political tribalism, or vague therapeutic spirituality. These are exactly the false gods he predicted. Modern individualism seems to vindicate Friedrich's emphasis on self-creation. We're told to be authentic, find ourselves, create our own meaning. Self-help culture preaches something like, become who you are. Instagram philosophy quotes Nietzsche alongside Buddha and Rumi, but Friedrich would probably mock this appropriation. Modern individualism often means consumer choice rather than self-overcoming. We find ourselves by picking from pre-existing options, not by creating new values. We're individuals within very narrow, conformist bounds. The Superman appears in Silicon Valley rhetoric about disrupting industries and transcending human limitations. Tech billionaires quote Friedrich while building companies to enhance human capabilities. Transhumanists want to overcome biological limits through technology. But is this what Friedrich meant? The Superman was about psychological strength and spiritual independence, not technological enhancement or wealth accumulation. He'd probably despise the tech elite's combination of will to power in business with conventional morality in everything else. Political uses of Friedrich continue on both left and right. Conservatives claim his critique of egalitarianism and celebration of hierarchy. Leftists use his genealogical method to critique power structures and expose ideology. Both sides find ammunition in his work. The eternal recurrence resonates in unexpected ways. Climate change forces us to consider whether we'd want our civilization recurring eternally. Social media makes us obsessively curate lives we could show without shame. The thought experiment remains powerful. His perspectivism anticipated postmodern questioning of objective truth. The idea that knowledge reflects power and interest, that no neutral standpoint exists, that truth serves particular purposes, all this comes partly from Friedrich. But he'd probably reject simplistic relativism and the idea that all perspectives are equally valid. He believed in better and worse perspectives, more honest and less honest thinking, life-affirming and life-denying values. His psychological insights remain relevant. The analysis of resentment, guilt, and sublimation influenced Freud and still helps explain human motivation. His observations about how we rationalize our desires and disguise will to power stay pertinent. The master-slave morality distinction illuminates modern debates. Populist resentment of elites echoes slave morality's dynamic. Social justice language about privilege and oppression uses genealogical thinking to expose power relationships hiding behind apparently neutral values. But the distinction also enables bad faith arguments. Those defending inequality invoke Friedrich while ignoring his contempt for inherited aristocracy and wealth. Those attacking weakness forget his own years of vulnerability and suffering. Perhaps Friedrich's greatest contemporary relevance is his fundamental question: how do we create meaning in a world without God? Science explains how things work, but not why they matter. Technology gives us power, but not purpose. Democracy gives us equality, but not excellence. We're still grappling with the consequences of God's death that Friedrich diagnosed, still trying to find values that aren't just thin disguises for will to power or resentment. Still searching for ways to affirm life despite its suffering. As we reach the end of Friedrich Nietzsche's story, what can we say about this brilliant, troubled, profoundly influential thinker? His life was marked by contradiction: a philologist who abandoned scholarship, a philosopher who rejected systems, a celebrator of health who was constantly ill, a teacher of strength who spent years helpless. He challenged everything Western culture took for granted: the existence of objective morality, the value of truth, the coherence of the self, the possibility of free will, the reality of progress, the meaning of suffering. Nothing was safe from his questioning. Yet despite the radicalism of his thought, Friedrich was in many ways quite conventional. He never married or had children, but craved companionship. He dreamed of academic success, even while making it impossible. He wanted recognition, fame, influence, even as he claimed not to care about such things. His work went through stages of reception that would have pleased and horrified him. First ignored, then embraced by the wrong people for wrong reasons, then rejected as dangerous, then carefully rehabilitated, then turned into Instagram quotes and self-help slogans. The trajectory is almost comically ironic. What remains valuable in Friedrich's thought? Several things stand out. His genealogical method for uncovering hidden origins of concepts we take for granted. His insight that morality reflects power relationships rather than eternal truth. His psychological penetration into motivation, resentment, and self-deception. His fundamental question about meaning after God's death has not been answered satisfactorily. We still struggle with nihilism, still grasp for values that aren't just preference or convention. Friedrich didn't provide complete answers, but he posed the question with unprecedented clarity and force. His emphasis on becoming who you are, on self-creation and self-overcoming, remains inspiring even if the Superman ideal seems distant. In an age of conformity and mass culture, the call to develop individual excellence, to resist herd mentality, to create your own values, still resonates. But his work also carries dangers. The language of strength and weakness, master and slave, higher and lower humans, can too easily justify cruelty and hierarchy. His contempt for democracy and equality sounds elitist at best, proto-fascist at worst. His influence on the Nazis, however unfair, warns about ideas' unpredictable trajectories. The personal cost of Friedrich's philosophy also gives pause. His life was largely miserable: chronic pain, isolation, poverty, madness, and only posthumous recognition. Is this the price of thinking so radically? Should we admire someone who couldn't find happiness themselves yet prescribed it for others? Yet perhaps this makes his life affirmation more impressive rather than less. That someone in constant pain could say yes to life, could advocate strength while weak, could celebrate joy while suffering, shows remarkable courage. His amor fati wasn't easy optimism, but hard-won acceptance. What would Friedrich want his legacy to be? Probably not academic respectability, not incorporation into university curricula, certainly not Instagram quotes. He'd want to be dynamite, exploding comfortable certainties, forcing people to think radically about meaning and value. He'd want readers to use his ideas as tools for their own self-creation, not as dogmas to follow. He'd want to inspire questioning, not provide answers. He'd want to be challenge rather than comfort. And in that sense, his work succeeds. Engaging seriously with Friedrich is uncomfortable. He makes easy atheism harder by showing its implications. He makes easy morality impossible by revealing its origins. He makes easy individualism shallow by demanding real self-overcoming. Whether you accept his conclusions or not, wrestling with his questions is valuable. Can we create meaningful values without God? How do we overcome nihilism? What does authentic existence look like? How should we respond to suffering? These aren't just academic questions, but existential ones. As the evening grows late and we come to the end of this biography, Friedrich Nietzsche remains what he was: difficult, brilliant, contradictory, dangerous, inspiring. A philosopher who matters not because he gave right answers, but because he asked better questions, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps philosophy's task isn't solving problems, but posing them more clearly. Perhaps the thinker's gift isn't certainty, but productive uncertainty. Perhaps we remember Friedrich not despite his contradictions, but because of them. He wanted to change how humanity thinks about God and morality and meaning. In that, he succeeded beyond even his grandiose self-assessment. He didn't destroy God, but he forced us to think seriously about what God's death means. He didn't create new values, but he showed why we desperately need them. The man with the magnificent mustache who walked alone in Swiss mountains, thinking dangerous thoughts, crying from intensity, speaking truths others feared, this man changed philosophy forever. And on that note, our bedtime biography of Friedrich Nietzsche Thank you for joining us on this journey through Friedrich Nietzsche's remarkable and troubling life. As we settle in for the night, let's reflect on what we've learned from this complicated figure who tried to teach humanity how to live without God. Friedrich was born into a world of certainty, a Lutheran pastor's son in conservative Prussia, where God, morality, and tradition seemed eternal. He died in a world teetering on the edge of everything he predicted: the death of old values, the rise of nihilism, the search for new meanings, and tragically, the misuse of his ideas to justify horrors. In between, he lived a life that was often lonely and painful, but always intellectually honest. He refused easy answers. He wouldn't pretend to believe what he didn't. He followed his thoughts wherever they led, even when they led to uncomfortable places, even when following them cost him friends, career, and health. What made Friedrich Nietzsche unique wasn't just his ideas, but his commitment to living by them. When he said amor fati, love your fate, He meant it even while enduring chronic migraines. When he said become who you are, he was working it out in his own life. When he said the Superman must create values, he was trying to create them himself. His failures are as instructive as his successes. He never achieved the amor fati he preached. He struggled with resentment and bitterness. His own life hardly exemplified flourishing. Yet he kept pushing, kept thinking, kept trying to articulate a vision of human excellence that didn't depend on God or conventional morality. The tragedy of his final decade, that mental collapse erasing all he'd built, adds poignant dimension to his philosophy. The man who celebrated mental strength lost his mind. The thinker who advocated self-overcoming couldn't overcome his illness. The philosopher of power became completely powerless. Yet somehow this doesn't invalidate his ideas. If anything, it makes them more human, more moving. These weren't thoughts from on high, but struggles of someone grappling with existence's basic questions while suffering intensely. His sister's distortion of his legacy, the Nazi appropriation, the decades of misunderstanding, all this shows how ideas escape their creator's control. Friedrich couldn't protect his philosophy from abuse any more than he could protect his body from illness. Both were vulnerable to forces beyond his power. But the slow rehabilitation of his reputation, the careful scholarship disentangling his actual views from distortions, the ongoing engagement with his questions, this shows that truth has its own kind of power. The real Nietzsche eventually emerged from beneath the layers of misuse. Today, Friedrich Nietzsche stands as one of modern philosophy's giants, alongside figures like Marx, Freud, and Darwin, who fundamentally changed how we understand human existence. Like them, he's both celebrated and controversial. Like them, he's often cited and rarely read carefully. Like them, he's impossible to ignore. His central insights remain vital, that our values have histories and serve purposes, that strength matters, but what counts as strength needs rethinking, that losing God means more than just no longer believing in supernatural being, that creating meaning is harder and more necessary than receiving it from tradition. Whether we agree with his specific conclusions matters less than engaging seriously with his questions. Can we build meaningful lives without divine authority? What would truly life-affirming values look like? How do we overcome ourselves to become better? What would it mean to say yes to existence completely? These aren't easy questions. Friedrich didn't offer easy answers, but he showed that asking them honestly, following where they lead, trying to live by our conclusions, this is what philosophy demands. Not just academic exercise, but existential practice. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of mountain peaks where air is clear and thinking comes sharp. Perhaps you'll imagine what it would mean to live so fully that eternal recurrence would be joy rather than horror. Perhaps you'll wonder what values you'd create if you couldn't appeal to any authority beyond yourself. Or perhaps you'll simply rest, grateful that someone had courage to think these difficult thoughts so thoroughly, to question so radically, to push so far beyond comfortable certainties. Friedrich Nietzsche did the hard work of thinking past God's death. We inherit both the crisis and the possibility he revealed. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow you can continue creating your own meaning, becoming who you are, saying yes to your life. That perhaps would be the greatest tribute to Friedrich's memory. Not agreement with all his ideas, but commitment to his fundamental task of living authentically, thinking honestly, and daring to question everything. And so we conclude our time with this remarkable, difficult, endlessly fascinating philosopher. The little pastor's son who became God's fiercest critic, the sickly wanderer who taught strength, the lonely thinker who changed how millions think about meaning. This was Friedrich Nietzsche, and this has been his bedtime biography. Until next time, sleep peacefully, dream boldly, and never stop questioning.